Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Tamara Behrens, and I'm honored to be hosting this camera webinar with Adam Levick. A bit about my background. I was born and raised in London, and I'm a former Camera on Campus associate. I am now a Krauthammer Fellow, writer, and journalist at Mosaic magazine. I am speaking to you live from Israel, just a few miles away from our guest, Adam Levick, co-editor of Camera UK, whom we will hear from shortly. First, let's talk a bit about this evening's subject, anti-Semitism after Corbyn. What a day to be discussing this topic. Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the British Labour Party from September 2015 until April 2020. Under Corbyn's leadership, nascent anti-Semitism in the Labour Party became endemic. Corbyn combined a radical political platform with anti-Israel views that frequently veered into anti-Semitism. He subverted the party from within and was able to get away with degrading British Jews for over 5 years. Today, he was finally suspended from the Labour Party. New Labour Party leader Keir Starmer took swift action to suspend Jeremy Corbyn following a report from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, a public watchdog, which found that the Labour Party breached British equality legislation. Corbyn's own dismissive response to the release of the report today showed that he is unrepentant. He said, and I quote, "The scale of the problem was also dramatically overstated for political reasons by our opponents inside and outside the party, as well as much of the media." Suspending him is a positive step forward, but there is much more work to be done. Jeremy Corbyn's legacy will impact the Labour Party and the British Jewish community for decades to come. Let's recap briefly some of Corbyn's most problematic behaviour. Jeremy Corbyn has a long history of involvement with Britain's most prominent anti-Zionist organisations, such as the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, as well as fringe anti-Semitic groups like Dear Yassin Remembered. Describing Hamas and Hezbollah as his friends, he made anti-Israel views mainstream in British politics. The makeup of the Labour Party changed entirely under Jeremy Corbyn, as viciously anti-Semitic party activists were admitted in huge numbers and became the loudest voices at party meetings. At Corbyn's last party conference, the hall was filled with attendees waving flags, not British flags, but Palestinian flags. Jewish activists, members of parliament, and public figures were attacked one by Corbyn's loyal followers and bullied out of the Labour Party. Corbyn and his closest allies portrayed the pervasive anti-Semitism in the Labour Party as a hoax, a conspiracy theory, refusing to acknowledge its existence, and for weeks fed the lie that anti-Semitism was contrived by Jewish media for political gain. Slowly, however, the British public began to see behind the lies. Investigative journalists uncovered incriminating evidence of Corbyn's personal anti-Semitism. There are simply too many examples to name, but let us note a few. In 2014, Corbyn laid a wreath at the grave of terrorists who committed the 1972 Munich massacre of the Israeli Olympic team. And in 2013, at a Palestinian Return Center event, he accused British Zionists of having no sense of irony, despite having lived in this country for a very long time. As these news stories emerged, brave members of parliament such as Luciana Berger, who is Jewish, and non-Jewish friends of the community like Joan Ryan, left the party out of principle. With Jewish members of parliament and activists sidelined or driven out, the party itself was fundamentally changed. Many thought the situation was beyond repair. That is, until the most recent British election in December 2019. Jeremy Corbyn lost by a landslide to now Prime Minister Boris Johnson and was left with no choice other than to resign. The British Labour Party's new leader, Keir Starmer, was chosen in April 2020 to replace Corbyn. Now we all want to know, especially after today's decision to suspend Corbyn, what does British anti-Semitism after Corbyn look like? Well, who better to tell us than Adam Levick? Adam Levick is co-editor of Camera UK and has been with Camera since 2012. Prior to that, he was managing editor of SIFWatch, the blog which later became Camera UK. Adam has published in-depth reports on progressive anti-Semitism for the Jerusalem Centre for Public Affairs, and his op-eds have appeared in The Guardian, The Independent, The Irish Examiner, The Jewish Chronicle, The Forward, The Jerusalem Post, and many more publications. Adam made Aliyah from Philadelphia in 2009. Make sure to ask questions using the Q&A function on your screens. We want this to be interactive, and we look forward to hearing from you. After Adam speaks, I will ask a few of my own questions, and then we will take some of yours. Over to you, Adam.
Thanks very much, Tamara. I'm going to begin just to place the post-Corbyn era in proper perspective by noting my trip to the UK on the eve of the December 2019 election. I was there to give 2 talks about media bias, but I think more importantly, I was there also on a fact-finding mission of sorts. Though I had, of course, closely followed the Labour anti-Semitism crisis since 2015, when Jeremy Corbyn became Labour leader, I really wanted to get a sense of how British Jews, and their allies in the fight against Jew hatred were feeling about the prospect of Corbyn becoming PM. There's a lot you can gain by emails and by Twitter, but in those face-to-face conversations, it's really easier to get a sense of how people are really feeling. So I had meetings with several prominent British Jews and campaigners against anti-Semitism. And though they don't share the same views and though there are political differences, there was clearly a common thread. And I can only describe that properly by saying there was a feeling of depression and more than a little fear. It's like how they asked, could the country they love so much, the country they trusted as a safe place for British Jews, suddenly be on the verge of electing someone as prime minister who's personally anti-Semitic? They felt almost betrayed. And indeed, organized Jewry was on, at that time, on the eve of the December 2019 election, what could only be characterized as war footing. And these were professionals who aren't alarmists by nature. They aren't people that think the sky's falling. These are very cautious, sober-minded professionals who have been doing this for a lot of years. And there was legitimate alarm. So how bad was it? Polls showed that 87% of Jews thought that Jeremy Corbyn was personally anti-Semitic. And just following the media, there was a point at which, maybe 2 years into the scandal, when media outlets began, they ceased to say things such as, though Corbyn isn't probably personally anti-Semitic, he's allowed an anti-Semitic environment to take place. That narrative kind of eroded at a certain point. And it became common in a British media landscape that's usually afraid of accusing someone of racism to refer to him as the anti-Semitic Labour Party leader. 85% thought the party had become institutionally anti-Semitic. Just to give you a comparison, only 1.7% thought that former Prime Minister Theresa May was anti-Semitic. Another glaring statistic, 40% of Jews in a poll considered leaving the UK if Jeremy Corbyn won and became prime minister. That's a staggering number. Even more interesting, I thought, someone who follows the British and the British newspapers religiously, the 3 major Jewish newspapers, the Jewish News, the Jewish Chronicle, and Manchester's Jewish newspaper, published a joint editorial. And they referred to Jeremy Corbyn as, quote, an existential threat to Jewish life in the UK. Well, first of all, this was the first joint editorial these publications had ever printed. And the fact that they use such a strong term, and again, I want to emphasize that just like I mentioned with the organized Jewish community and their leaders, the editors, who I know to some degree, are not alarmists. And the fact that they would use language like an existential threat to Jewish life was itself staggering, and I think worth noting. All right, so in order to understand what Jeremy Corbyn represents, we must remember just a few principles, and Tamara did a good job of laying that out, but I just want to emphasize a few important points. His radical left extremist ideology not only made him pro-Palestinian, but oftentimes pro-Palestinian terrorism as well. Further, his immutable belief in the righteousness of the Palestinian cause blinded him to classic forms of anti-Semitism that came from both Palestinians and their supporters in the UK. He was so convinced that he was an anti-racist whose mom marched against fascists on Cable Street, and that anti-Semitism only came from the right, that he reacted with what can only be accurately described as contempt to accusations that he was personally compromised by anti-Semitism. So what were Jews concerned about? What specifically were they envisioning if he became prime minister? Well, British Israel ties would all but cease to exist. The government would almost certainly promote BDS. Zionism would be even more delegitimized in the UK than it already is. And that Corbyn would create a hostile environment for Jews in the UK, the 300,000 Jews in the UK, just like he did for the Jews in the Labour Party. Anti-Semitic bullying of Jews, especially Zionist Jews on social media and academia that we saw under Corbyn's later Labour leadership would spread. In essence, he would have made Jews, this is the way that Jews who spoke to me felt, he would have made them feel like they weren't welcome in their own country. That, to use a term used by a Holocaust describer to describe how Jews felt in the early years of Nazi Germany, that they were socially dead. Not that there would necessarily be widespread violence, but that they would feel socially dead. So moving on to the election, of course, as Tamara mentioned, Corbyn was trounced. It was the worst showing for Labour Party in 80 years. But, I was moved and really thought it was interesting to see some of the reactions by the op-eds and on Twitter by Jewish activists, by Jewish community leaders after the election. I mean, there was such a palpable sense of a collective sigh of relief. They were emotional. There were reports of Jews who went to synagogue the Saturday after the election and were crying. There was tears of joy, just that sense of relief that that the worst didn't happen. Stephen Pollard, the editor of the Jewish Chronicle, wrote this really moving op-ed where he basically said, UK, you didn't let us down. And then he said something along the lines of, which I thought was really interesting, I'm sorry that I ever doubted you. These are the words of people that have everything invested in their country, who love their country. And that love was put into question, and the election results gave them a new, fresh breath of confidence. All right, so let's move on to Keir Starmer. Let's go from the good to the bad. The good, of course, his name isn't Jeremy Corbyn. He has a Jewish wife. He's raising his children Jewish. And more importantly, there's absolutely no suggestion whatsoever that he's anti-Semitic. He's not an ideological extremist. In fact, if anything, he's a political neophyte. He's only been an MP since 2015. There's no accusations that he's ever engaged in anti-Semitism, and he's certainly not a Palestinian terror supporter. Also, thus far, the consensus from prominent campaigners against anti-Semitism that I spoke to is that he's set the right tone from day one. Shortly after becoming Labour leader, he said on behalf of the Labour Party, "I'm sorry, I am sorry," words that never really came out of Jeremy Corbyn's mouth. And he promised to tear out this poison of anti-Semitism by its roots, and that people should judge his success by the return of Jewish members and those who felt they could no longer support us. He emphasized more than once, Labour is under new management. Jewish community leaders who met with him praised him, said they were confident that he's moving in the right direction. Many of you might recall that he sacked Rebecca Long-Bailey, the shadow education minister, after she endorsed an interview with The Independent with actress Maxine Peake, where the actress blamed Israel to some degree for US racist police violence. He's been working within the party infrastructure to try to get a pro-Keir Starmer majority on the National Executive Committee. Basically one of the most important mechanisms within Labour Party that makes decisions. He's basically been trying to wrestle control of the party apparatuses away from the Corbynistas. Another symbolic, but I think important step, MP Ruth Smith, who's the vice chair of the Jewish labor movement, was chosen by Starmer to give an introduction to Starmer ahead of his party conference speech. These are symbolic, but I think send the correct signal to British Jews. There was also a multi-million-pound settlement with the Labour Party over the whistleblowers. If you may recall, there was a BBC Panorama program hosted by John Ware that revealed a whole bunch of whistleblowers within the Labour Party who were smeared by Labour after the show broadcast and said that they had some hidden agenda. They had some, they weren't really serious. They were lying. They were making it up. They were in it for ulterior motives. So Labour settled a multi-million-pound lawsuit, and this was against the wishes of Jeremy Corbyn. All right, a few problematic things, however. He hasn't yet set up an independence complaint process, and we'll get to that in a second when we get to the EHRC's verdict. But the independent complaints process would be to adjudicate anti-Semitism charges like that he promised. And it's still taking way too long, according to, again, campaigners that I spoke to get anti-Semitic members expelled. But I think the context and just reading between the lines and reading the various accounts of what's going on in the Labour Party, he's really, I think, trying to avoid a civil war between the various factions in his party, the factions being the hard left, like the Jeremy Corbyn fans, the soft left, of which I would characterize Keir Starmer, trade union members, also sometimes known as the old right, and Blairites. So he's been to some degree treading cautiously. His goal is to win the next election. And I think he's made the strategic decision, if for no other reason, that if they're going to win the next election, they should avoid a civil war. So I think he clearly, for various reasons, wants to rid the party of the stain of anti-Semitism, which brings us to the EHRC, Equality and Human Rights Commission verdict. A little background, the EHRC is the UK's national equality body. They're tasked with enforcing the laws that protect people against discrimination. Now, the grassroots organization Campaign Against Anti-Semitism made the original complaint to the EHRC, accusing it of being institutionally anti-Semitic in 2018, followed by literally hundreds of pages of submissions. Other submissions were sent by the Jewish labor movement and by the group Labor Against Anti-Semitism. In 2019, the AHRC launched an investigation to see if Labor broke the country's laws, their equity laws, by engaging in unlawful discrimination, harassment, and victimization of Jews in the party, and whether or not the party created a toxic atmosphere for Jews, and whether they had a systemic failure to investigate complaints and discipline members who were guilty of anti-Semitism. Just some context, which I think is very instructive. The only political party that was found to be institutionally racist by the AHRC since it was set up was the far-right British National Party. All right, so the AHRC report was fortunately released today. It gave me time to read 130 pages and get up to speed on it. And the verdict was that Labor broke the equalities law on anti-Semitism on 3 counts: harassment, political interference in complaints, and failure of process. It found serious failings in the top leadership and an inadequate process for handling anti-Semitism complaints. Also of interest, it found a lack of willingness to tackle anti-Semitism rather than an inability to do so. Labor refused to investigate, for instance, and this was an example that I read in the EHRC report. Labor immediately refused to investigate accusations of anti-Semitism if it involved retweets of anti-Semitic material, meaning they were only going to investigate anti-Semitism on social media if the tweet was, the original wording was by the person being accused, so that a Labour Party member or even MP could retweet Holocaust denial, but since it wasn't in his own words or her own words, that person wouldn't be subject to disciplinary procedures, which is pretty remarkable. The HRC report also found that the Labour Party officials themselves had used anti-Semitic tropes in dismissing claims of anti-Semitism, and often suggested that the complaints of anti-Semitism were fake or smears. There were 2 Labour Party officials with official standing, that is, they were agents of the party, not just members, who were found guilty of anti-Semitic harassment. One of which I'm sure most of you have heard of. His name is Ken Livingstone, the former mayor of London. Ken Livingstone alleged that, and this is the example that the AHRC report noted, that He alleged that the scrutiny of a MP named Naz Shah, who was found to have shared on social media anti-Semitic Facebook posts, that she was innocent, Livingstone said, and that she was guilty of a smear campaign by the Israel lobby, whose motivation was to stigmatize critics of Israel as anti-Semitic. Where have we heard that before? The HRC said that this had the effect of stirring up and fueling hatred for Jews. It also, the HRC report found countless acts of anti-Semitism by Labor Party members who weren't officers. They weren't agents, they were just members. These anti-Semitic narratives, including expressing support for Hitler or the Nazis, comparing Israelis to Hitler or the Nazis, the argument that anti-Semitism complaints had been manufactured by the lobby, conspiracies about the Rothschilds and Jewish control over financial and government institutions, blaming Jews themselves for the anti-Semitism crisis in Labor Party, blaming Jews for the actions of the State of Israel, and accusing British Jews of greater loyalty to Israel than to Britain. Now, Labor has until December 10th to draft an action plan to implement the HRC's recommendations, which is legally enforceable by a court if not fulfilled. And the recommendations, though they take up a lot of pages, basically demand that the Labor Party send up, as Starmer promised, an independent complaints process, that they train Labor Party officials in handling anti-Semitism, and more importantly, that the racially charged culture, the anti-Semitic culture that was set up under Jeremy Corbyn on his watch, that be tackled immediately and forcefully. Now, the reaction of the EHRC report by Jewish groups was positive. The Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, which again was the first organization to submit a complaint to the HRC, which prompted the investigation, as well as other British Jewish groups like the Board of Deputies and the CST, all said that they were pleased with the report today. Keir Starmer, in a press conference a few hours ago, said that he accepted in full and will implement in full all the recommendations, and said it's a day of shame for his party, and he personally apologized to the Jewish community. And as Tamara said, he suspended Jeremy Corbyn following Corbyn's comments on Facebook, blaming the media and blaming politics for the EHRC's report. So I think we can conclude very clearly that the EHRC report gave Starmer, I guess what I would term as political capital to begin cleaning house. If Starmer had been acting cautiously up until now, I think his decision was to use the HRC report, which everybody assumed would be pretty strong and pretty damning, to begin cleaning house. And he began with Corbyn, and I think that sends a really chilling message if you are a Corbynista in the party. Now, what are the immediate or long-term impact on the UK of the Corbyn anti-Semitism crisis? Well, at least in the short term, I think there seems to have been a somewhat greater sensitivity to anti-Semitism, even in the media. I've been following the British media for 10 or 11 years now. And I definitely saw a change at some point, maybe 2016, 2017. There was a reluctance to question Jewish claims of anti-Semitism within the Labor Party. There is a good, pretty good journalism, even from media outlets that are hostile, extremely hostile to Israel, when it came to reporting on revelations about anti-Semitic comments or pro-terrorism comments by Corbyn or his officials. And this is, I think, one of the great takeaways, and one of the, as horrible as this 4-year saga has been, I find it very interesting and very important that I think that British Jews, and I think they would be the first to tell you, that they kind of grew to become much more assertive in speaking out against and fighting anti-Semitism. The idea of keeping a low profile, keeping your head down, and not making waves just seemed to fail the reality test that the moment called for an altogether new strategy. And I think the British Jews were energized and really did, for the most part, though there were some dissenters, for the most part, they spoke with one voice, and they spoke strongly and unapologetically. And if you follow the conversations on Twitter, people that never would have gotten involved in conversations about anti-Semitism were empowered and emboldened and angry And I think that's a positive development for British Jews moving forward. And let's also remember that the UK, relative to other countries in the world, is a country with a very low rate of anti-Semitism. There's a ADL Global poll that I cite frequently on anti-Semitic attitudes by I think close to 150 countries. And actually the UK is somewhere around where the US is. That is one of the lower rates of anti-Semitism for a Western democracy, or one of the lower rates overall. Now, that doesn't say there aren't problems, but it says that in general, I would argue that the anti-Semitism problem that arose under Jeremy Corbyn doesn't mean that most Britons even come close to sharing those views. It means that Corbyn was successful at empowering a relatively small minority of extremist activists and was able to give them power. So that's a big distinction between a country that is endemically anti-Semitic versus a country that isn't. Now, what are the long-term immediate impacts, the negative impacts of everything that's happened? Excuse me. Despite Corbyn's huge defeat, his reign as party leader, I would argue, energized the radical anti-Zionist left. You know, they got awfully close to achieving political power. And I think they're in some ways going to be emboldened to some degree also. And even more depressingly, polls show that Labour members, on average, still support Jeremy Corbyn's radical agenda. And a few British Jewish activists who I spoke to were fearful that their community will be blamed for years to come, if not longer, for torpedoing their quote unquote progressive Jeremy Corbyn. You know, there definitely are some problem areas that we need to be concerned about. So at the end of the day, what's my prognosis? Well, for Jewish Zionist members of the Labour Party, it's still going to be a long fight. Despite, excuse me, the progress that Keir Starmer has made, especially today in suspending Jeremy Corbyn, it takes a long time to root out an institutionally anti-Semitic organization. A couple good American political analogies, which I think are instructive. You have to go back, of course, a lot of years, but how mainstream conservatives chased out the John Birch Society wing of their movement, or how mainstream liberals chased out communist elements from the labor movement and from Hollywood. You know, both these political phenomenon took time, took years, and took commitment by mainstream leaders to root out these forces, but ultimately they were removed. And I am cautiously optimistic that that will be the same within the Labour Party. Now, for the future of British Jews, again, I'm cautiously optimistic. The community can't be complacent, and they must remember that, however, that the perfect is the enemy of the good. Today was a good day for British Jews, and in some sense, I would argue, for diaspora Jews everywhere. However, let's not forget that anti-Semitism in the UK is more than just a Jeremy Corbyn Labour Party problem. The impact of BDS and delegitimization within academia and within media outlets like The Guardian and the BBC will definitely continue. And as we've argued so many times persuasively, that anti-Israel bias fuels anti-Semitism, and that's not going away. While I said before that media outlets who were historically hostile to the Jewish community had some bit of a learning moment when it comes to anti-Semitism, explicit forms of anti-Semitism, I don't think there's any such level of learning when it comes to how anti-Israel bias and the demonization of Israel similarly fuels anti-Semitism. However, you know, I guess if I had to give you my major long-term concern, it goes more than just the delegitimization campaign, because BDS and delegitimization campaigns, the cognitive war against Israel, all stem from ideas. Ideas move the world. And in the year 2020, my major long-term concern is the rise of what I would argue are increasingly influential intellectual movements, such as intersectionality, the quote-unquote social justice movement, critical race theory. Ideas, though once obscure and consigned to academia, have grown in popularity and contain with them the seeds that have convinced many otherwise sober and anti-racist voices that Jews, since they are considered to be white and since they are relatively successful, can't really be victims of oppression or racism. And I would argue that similarly, decidedly illiberal ideas that have taken hold in the US recently and in the UK, such as the attack on meritocracy or the attack on liberal traditions such as free speech and other democratic norms that we all value and care about so much, that this attack on these liberal traditions will not be good for the Jews. Just a few words about American Jews, which, as you can hear from my accent, I grew up in America, and I think I still know quite a bit about the American Jewish world. And certainly there's similarities and differences between British Jewish community and the American Jewish community. But I would just ask American Jews to really study the harrowing experience of British Jews over the last 5 years and, make an effort to learn from it and to not repeat the same mistakes. Let's be clear about a few things. Anti-Semitism is a right-wing phenomenon. It is a left-wing phenomenon, and it is a phenomenon in the Muslim world. And anyone who fails to take all three of these manifestations of Jew hatred seriously is not serious about fighting anti-Semitism. So in closing, just to give a little broad perspective, as we know, COVID-19 is a once-in-a-century pathogen, which hopefully will be eradicated in the coming year when a vaccine is widely distributed. However, as I think everybody knows, even if the specific ideological virus of Corbynism is eradicated, and I hope it is, it's certainly clear that there will never be a vaccine for the decidedly mutable virus of anti-Semitism. The immediate threat for British Jews have passed, and they've lived to fight another day. But as the fight against anti-Semitism, I would argue, will never be one of total victory, we will have to be content with winning by not losing. Before I turn it over to Tamara for questions, I just want to express my sincere thanks to all the camera supporters out there who make my work possible and who make the work of all my colleagues at Camera possible. Really, thank you very much. Tamara.
Thanks so much, Adam. Those were fascinating remarks. I'm sure we can all agree. I have a lot of questions, and I'm definitely going to take some questions from the audience, but I'm going to begin with a few of my own. First of all, let's talk a little bit more about the Equality and Human Rights Commission report that was just made public today. Obviously, it's hard to overstate how significant this is. So you spoke a bit about it already, but in more depth, what do you think the impact of this will be on the Labour Party? It's clear that Starmer has taken an important first step in suspending Jeremy Corbyn, but will he actually expel him from the party? Will Labour be able to meet the plan for the December 10 deadline that they have to actually implement the areas which the EHRC asked them to improve on? I'd love your thoughts on that.
Yes, to answer your question in short, yes. I think that the extremely detailed recommendations of the EHRC report go into dozens of pages on the specifics of the deficiencies within the Labour Party disciplinary process. He's committed to enacting every one of them. He didn't say that he would look at them. He didn't say he'd review them. He didn't say he'd do what he can. He said he was committed to implementing their exact recommendations. And, such as, for instance, creating a truly independent disciplinary process, such as stopping the tradition that was under Corbyn of people within the leader's office interfering in the independent work of the people tasked with determining whether accusations of anti-Semitism are valid. One of the big revelations within the report was that despite Corbyn's denial over months and months and months, the report proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Corbyn, at least people in his office, interfered inappropriately with the disciplinary process. They would look at a name, and perhaps because they thought that this was a good guy or a good woman, they would decide to not even investigate it. So that kind of interference from the leader's office has to stop and will stop. And like I said before, I think, without getting bogged down into the details of this very long report, which is interesting in itself, I just think self-interest is a very strong motivation in politics. And I think there's every interest in the world for Keir Starmer to implement all the EHRC's recommendations in full and rid his party of anti-Semitism And there's almost no interest in seeing that the Corbynist wing flourishes. So I'm cautiously optimistic.
Thank you. Something that I find really interesting about Keir Starmer is his, relationship to Zionism. He said during the run-up to the Labour leadership contest that he wouldn't personally use the term Zionism to describe himself. And it's clear that British Jews have a strong attachment to this word. It sort of forms the bulk of how British Jews address themselves. Those that are pro-Israel will say, I'm a Zionist. Yet Keir Starmer feels uncomfortable using it. So I'm curious, why is the term Zionism such a problem in British public life? And is Keir Starmer's reluctance to associate with it something that is problematic?
It's interesting. I remember that the last, one of the recent Labour leaders, Ed Miliband, also had a very awkward encounter in which he's Jewish, of course, when he would become prime minister. He first said that he was a Zionist and then backtracked. And if you look actually at Keir Starmer's full remarks, it was during the Labour hustings, sponsored by a Jewish organization. Hustings, for those who don't know, it just means a debate for the party leadership. He actually first said he's not a Zionist, but then he strangely said, though I support Zionists, or I support Zionists, or something. He kind of, I don't think, really quite knew how to process that term. And I think, and though you might know a bit more about that, I think in the British ears, the word Zionism means pro-Israel. Whereas I think in the American Jewish community, you would say I'm pro-Israel, I support Israel. You don't really hear politicians in the in the US being asked if they're Zionists. It's just a different vocabulary. It's interesting. I've also heard other very prominent and confident British Jews who support Israel kind of back away from that term sometimes. So I would argue that I think the anti-Israel forces, the delegitimization forces, the BDS forces have done a good job of stigmatizing that term. And I think that term, though it of course only means supporting Israel's right to exist, has taken on a meaning that it doesn't mean and has made it almost toxic. And, however, just to get back to your question, I don't think the fact that Keir Starmer struggled with that word means that he's not a Zionist. I think maybe in that moment, he wasn't 100% sure what Zionism meant. But again, I think that the fact that term has been made toxic is probably the work of a lot of very committed anti-Israel activists.
Absolutely. Thanks, Adam. So though he is no longer prominent in the party, the kind of radical activism that Jeremy Corbyn embraced, some of the things that you touched on, intersectionality, critical race theory, and so on, these things have a lot of staying power in the West. So how will this continue to impact Jewish communities, the fact that Corbyn popularized this kind of radicalism?
I think it's the biggest threat looking forward, in my view. One of the things that Jeremy Corbyn to this day, in fact, I saw him interviewed even after he was suspended, he was interviewed by The Guardian, and he was still unrepentant. He believes in every bone in his body that since he's progressive and since he's anti-racist, that he can't be anti-Semitic. But I think there's a reason behind that. I think, I was reading a book about the Labour Party anti-Semitism crisis, written by co-written by a journalist from The Times, which is very interesting. And they interviewed someone who knows Corbyn ally well, and they said that, the fact that Jews are relatively successful, unlike the way they were in the 1930s, say in Britain, and that they seem to be doing economically well, they're prospering, that it's almost as if that disqualifies them from being considered to be a victim. It disqualifies them from being a victim of racism. But it's more than just the fact that it disqualifies them from the category of victim. It also makes them guilty, I think, in the eyes of some of these intersectionality ideologies. Because intersectionality, critical race theory, and the social justice movement more broadly, I'm using with the capital letters, meaning the movement, not people that are just for social justice, really is suspicious, and I would argue is continuing to engage in an attack on success itself. Because in their view, if you're not successful, it's because the system is intrinsically racist. If you are successful, just the corollary of that is that you must be successful because you got your gains in some sort of pernicious way, in some sort of dishonest way, that you gain the racist system for your own benefit. You know, Barry Weiss recently argued in a very interesting column for Tablet that, you know, the attack on liberal traditions that you see being given rise by these intellectual movements I spoke about is really dangerous, because Jews have historically thrived when liberal traditions have been strongest. There's no, question that within America, the reason why Jews have thrived was because liberal traditions, classical liberal traditions, have thrived, and that, the attack on free speech, the attack on merit, the attack on common understandings of what equality actually means and what it meant for generations of civil rights activists, both Jewish and African American, that's being eroded. And I think that unless the British Jewish community and the American Jewish community gets really a hold of what these ideas mean and how they percolate into the bloodstream, into the cognitive bloodstream, for lack of a better term, I think they're going to be at a real disadvantage, because the people that are arguing for these movements are very committed. And I think we have to really get a grip on what they mean and what they represent for the Jewish community.
Thanks, Adam. It's always fascinating to hear your observations on the British Jewish community and comparisons as well to the American context. Obviously, you have a lot of experience with both, which is what makes you such a fascinating analyst to have for a talk like this. So I'm going to ask one more of my own questions, and then I'll open it up to some really interesting audience questions that have been coming in. As a decades-long observer and analyst of the British Jewish community, what have you learned, Adam, about British Jews and anti-Semitism from your time working on this issue? Obviously, you've spent a lot of time there. I know you've touched a lot on this already, but I'm curious for your reflections. You've been doing this for a long time, about some things that might have surprised you about the British community, some things you admire. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think there's a couple things. I mean, the difference is, to some degree, look, British Jews were, like most diaspora communities throughout history, kicked out of England centuries ago, right? American Jews never dealt with that, right? American Jews had were rare in the sense that, they were never expelled from the country. Jews were expelled from most European countries and certainly from the UK. And British Jews I've spoken to, there's this sense that you continually have to prove your Britishness, that you're truly English, that you're one of them. And I think maybe that's why Corbyn's comment about Richard Millett, or about, British Jews, British Zionists, not understanding English irony, really just seemed to infuriate British Jews who are patriotic, who love their country, who, it really hit them the wrong way. Like, of all things, to otherize British Jews in a way like that was just so infuriating. So I think there always has been, in my experience, and I don't mean in any way to disparage the hard work and the fighting spirit of British Jews, but more of a confidence, I'd say, from American Jews. I mean, also because they're greater numbers. There's about 6 million American Jews based on the surveys. There's 300,000 at most British Jews in the UK. So I'd say American Jews have always been probably a bit more confident, probably have had a bit more influence to some degree. But at the same time, I really feel like my work over the past 10 years, I really got to know British Jews, and there really is just a difference. And I still regret to this day that I haven't learned anything about British football. I still can't speak intelligently about that. But I really feel like, when I hung out in London in 2019 on the eve of the election with British Jewish friends, it really felt nice. It really felt like these are people that I've gotten to know, that it's a culture I wouldn't have normally gotten to know as well as I did. So, there's both differences, but there's also a lot of similarities.
That's great. Thanks, Adam. So I'm going to move on to audience questions now. There's a lot of great ones. We'll try and get in as many as we can. The first I'm going to ask is pivoting from British Jews to American Jews. There were two really great questions that I'm going to put together. So what should US Jews learn from the Corbyn years? And the second question, which is connected, of course, is do you think the US Democratic Party, though far from it, might be heading in the same direction with its progressive wing, including some anti-Semitism with anti-Israel policy? And some other people that asked questions brought up the squad of progressive Democratic congresswomen. So wanted to know your thoughts about lessons for American Jews.
Okay, well, as I said, one of the lessons is to not be complacent, to understand that the Jewish history is full of examples of Jews feeling comfortable, and due to very particular historical situations or the rise of political figures, that comfort level can change overnight, and just not to take anything for granted. And to, and I think I want to go back to what I said earlier about the importance for people that are committed to fighting anti-Semitism to take all forms of anti-Semitism seriously, and that to be skeptical and to be very concerned if you come across someone who appears to be a anti-racist activist who talks about anti-Semitism, but somehow isn't able to vocalize and be clear that Jew hatred comes from the right, the left, and from the Muslim world. And I think that's the litmus test, right? Because the question is, Jews in America will be safe to the degree that their radar is honed in, that their radar for anti-Semitism is clear, and that it can identify a threat when they see it. Now, if people within their own ideological comfort zone express anti-Semitism, that's the test, right? Can you call it out? Can you call it out with the same anger, the same righteousness, the same determination as that anti-Jewish racism that comes from your political opponents? And I think that's the real test. And I think that kind of consistency and determination to be wide awake and to go to uncomfortable ideological places, wherever they may lead, wherever the facts may go, and this not being so concerned about staying within your political group. And I think we all probably suffer from that to some degree. None of us, I think, none of us are completely perfect when it comes to this, but I think, calling it out when you're seeing it, regardless of who the actor is really important. The question about the Democratic Party is interesting. Look, I certainly think there is currently a wing within the Democratic Party represented by some of the figures you mentioned, less AOC, Ilhan Omar, certainly, Rashid Tlaib, and others and look, to some degree, Bernie Sanders, but Bernie Sanders was not Jeremy Corbyn. That's a conversation for another day. But yes, I think there definitely is within the Democratic Party, I would argue still a small but growing segment that, look, they made themselves clear. There were a lot of people from that wing that were open in their support of Jeremy Corbyn, including Bernie Sanders, including Omar, including AOC, and including Rashida Tlaib. So there definitely is I'd say a small part of the Democratic Party that's moving in that direction. I think it's incumbent upon what I would argue is the majority of Democrats, Democratic Jews, Democrats who are pro-Israel, to fight that. The only people that can fight a rising level of anti-Semitism within an institution are people within those institutions. I would say, just as an American Israeli, but as someone who follows American politics closely, I am concerned. There's reason to be concerned. It's not just right-wing talking points, but I still would be cautious about, the level to which you engage in that. There's nothing right now that would make me concerned that what happened under Jeremy Corbyn is about to happen in the Democratic Party, at least anytime soon.
Okay, so moving on from politics to universities, we've had a lot of questions about the situation on campus in the UK. Is there major anti-Semitism at universities in the UK? What is the situation like there?
Well, I think again, one of the, I would say positive, I would say that British universities have become a little more sensitized to the problem of anti-Semitism as a result of what happened to Labour. There's still resistance by many of universities to adopt the IRA definition. However, I think this EHRC report and then the suspension of Jeremy Corbyn, I think can be used by activists, by people that are involved day to day, like Cameron campus, with fighting anti-Semitism on campus. I think used to say to universities, hey, this should be a wake-up call, that on the importance of what happens when you don't enforce IRA, when you don't take complaints by British Jewish students of anti-Semitism seriously. I think that if it's used correctly, I think that the state of the comfort level of British Jews, British students on universities can be improved, and they can use as leverage what's happened under Jeremy Corbyn. Sometimes it takes a awful situation to put pressure on institutions to do the right thing. But I think the immediate strategy should be to focus on IRA. I think universities adopting the IRA definition is one of the most important first steps to tackling the problem.
I think we have seen a lot of improvement actually since I left campus a year ago with regards to the IRA definition. And, that's definitely thanks to Cameron campus's work. And it was a privilege to be part of that organization while I was on campus. We have a lot of questions. I'm going to ask another question related to the Labour Party specifically, because I think it's a great one. So this question notes that when several Corbyn sympathising MPs were interviewed after a series of resignations from the Labour Party due to anti-Semitism, they all refused to say anti-Semitism was a problem and called those who resigned traitors. This shows that Corbyn was not the cause of anti-Semitism in the party, but a product of it. Can the party be changed, and how?
Well, so the argument was that Corbyn was a product of it, not a cause.
Yeah, well, he wasn't the cause. This is an audience question. I think what the questioner is saying is that the problem goes deeper than just Corbyn, and that members of parliament around him were willing to cover for him when he needed it, and to ignore the problem, not just ignore, but deny the problem of anti-Semitism.
Right. Look, I think a lot of what the answer is the refusal of radicals and even not so radicals within the Labour Party to really grapple with the idea that anti-Zionism and extreme hostility to Israel is unquestionably correlated with explicit anti-Semitic beliefs. That is, there are studies by the CST, recent, I think 2017, that showed, I guess not surprisingly, but I think importantly, that there was a strong correlation between people who hold classically anti-Semitic views and advanced anti-Semitic tropes and people that are anti-Israel. So that, and I think this is important because intuitively, those of us who fight the good fight every day weren't surprised. But I think the fact that we have empirical data to show that, if you're an anti-Israel activist and you're trying to organize an event on campus to label Israel an apartheid state, or if you're pro-BDS, chances are that you also just so happen to hold anti-Semitic views, believe Jews own the media or control British financial institutions, that the two are directly correlated. Now, correlation isn't causation, but I think one of the problems that the party needs to deal with, one of the problems that the British media still needs to deal with, is that when they incite about Israel, they're inciting about Jews, that there is a necessary connection between the two. When they print stories talking about how Israel is bombing children in Gaza, that is just, that's not just a dog whistle. It's exactly what anti-Semites want to hear. They want to hear that Jews are doing bad things. So I think the next step for Labour, the next step in the fight against anti-Semitism, is to try really hard to make people understand that you can't despise Israel, wish that it didn't exist, accuse it of being the most malevolent force on the earth, and also love Jews. It's just incredibly unlikely that that would, even conceivably happen in the real world. And that's a harder fight. That's a much harder fight. But I think that's something that we at Camera UK and my colleagues throughout the organization, and certainly on campus, that's something that we've been trying to do, and that's one of our primary missions. But I think British Jews should really think hard about the connection between those two, and why it's important to fight one in order to fight the other.
That's very interesting. Thank you. I think we have time for one last question. I really want to bring up something that people have mentioned in the Q&A that I know is, very near to your focus in terms of your work for Camera. I wanted to ask about the British media, which is obviously a crucial element of the Jeremy Corbyn saga in terms of breaking stories, reporting on the issues at play, and often shaping the chain of events. So I wanted to ask whether you think, from your work on the British media over the last decade, have things improved? Do they stand to improve further? What is your sort of understanding now as we're kind of hopefully coming out of the Corbyn era slowly? Perhaps your retrospective on the last few years in terms of the British media and Jews and anti-Semitism and Israel.
Let me say a couple things. I mean, first, I don't think most journalists, or anywhere near most journalists, are anti-Semitic. However, I do think there is a blind spot when it comes to anti-Semitism. I think that, for instance, most journalists most Jerusalem correspondents working for British media outlets probably can't talk intelligently about the IRA definition. So I think that the Corbyn scandal has sensitized the media to some degree when it comes to the most explicit forms of anti-Semitism. And I see just a caution and a reluctance to question the motives of Jews. These are the things that I see every day, and it's hard to underline a sentence where that is conveyed, but it just, that's clear in my contextualizing the British media. But like I said in my previous question, I still think when it comes to Israel, they feel that all bets are off and that Israel is a fair game. And I think they oftentimes don't see that correlation that I mentioned between hatred of Israel and hatred of Jews. And I think you see it in the way that media outlets parrot and peddle the most ridiculous anti-Israel accusations from NGOs, from Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, from other BDS groups. It seems like they are truly convinced that these are humanitarians, that are anti-racist, that wake up in the day truly not having a problem with Jews, and that their problem is only that they're pro-Palestinian. I think until media outlets wrap their minds around the fact that, and as I think research by people like David Collier has shown, a disproportionate majority of pro-Palestinian activists, and I think this has been documented, harbor anti-Semitic views, are open in their anti-Semitism about on social media, and are clearly motivated by not love of Palestinians, but of animosity towards Jews. And I think, that's going to be the big task that the media is going to have to grapple with. I'm not optimistic in the short term, but I wake up every day working towards seeing to it that, there's at least some movement, that there's some understanding that our message is clear, that that's what they need to get a hold of. If they truly want to take anti-Semitism seriously, they're going to have to wrap their minds with the connection between anti-Zionism, anti-Israel attitudes, and Jew hatred.
Adam, thank you. Before we wrap up, I just want to thank you again for your fascinating observations. I hope everyone enjoyed the conversation and learned something new. We definitely had a lot of questions coming from the audience about the work that Camera is doing in the UK. So I would encourage everyone to continue to follow Camera UK, follow Adam, follow Camera on Campus UK, which is doing fantastic work in the campus space. Unfortunately, anti-Semitism is a societal disease that might never go away, but I'm comforted by the fact that analysts like Adam have made it their life's work to stand up for truth and integrity and stand against anti-Semitism. As I said, make sure to follow our Camera, head to camera.org to stay in touch with us. If you'd like to read some of my work on anti-Semitism, you can head over to mosaicmagazine.com and type in my name. Please stay tuned for more webinars in the future. It's been a pleasure, Adam. Thank you everyone for tuning in. That concludes today's event.